The NTSB preliminary report is out on November 666 Delta Sierra, the Cessna Citation that crashed in San Diego on the 22nd of May. In the early morning, pre-dawn darkness with weather well below minimums. My name's Juan Brown. You're watching the BLANCOLIRIO channel, and this video is brought to you by you viewers who support this channel here on Patreon. And looking at the number of odds that this pilot stacked against himself, it's no wonder that this approach ended in tragedy. Let's check it out. We first covered this crash shortly after it happened, and this NTSB preliminary report pretty much corroborates everything said in this video with a few additional data points. The approach the pilot was attempting to fly after flying all the way across the country all night, including a stop halfway across the country with a plane load of passengers, was this RNAV GPS runway 28 at Montgomery Field. The minimums for this approach are 3/4 of a mile visibility. Unfortunately, the ATIS or ASOS was in-op, so the actual accurate weather and altimeter setting could not be reported for the arrival station. If the pilot had LNAV VNAV capability, the decision altitude would be 750 feet. If the pilot was only flying the LNAV portion of the approach, his minimum descent altitude would be 840 feet. According to the report, this pilot descended all the way down to 464 feet in the fog before striking the power lines short of the runway. The best weather approach controllers could give this pilot was Miramar Naval Air Station, which was reporting 200-foot ceiling, a half-mile visibility. Miramar located 3 nautical miles away from the accident site. So there were a total of 6 fatalities on board the aircraft and 8 minor injuries on the ground. The pilot had recently received a single pilot FAA exemption to operate his Cessna Citation jet, and that was back in December of 2024, so less than a year ago. So what's a single pilot exemption? This is just an example exemption. This is not the accident pilot's exemption. And this to me is another major hole in the Swiss cheese, operating in these IMC conditions single pilot with relatively low time in the aircraft instead of having a co-pilot to help assist you with your hard IFR flying in these sort of conditions. But a single pilot exemption typically lists a whole lot of things that you got to comply with and some additional compliances regarding the minimum types of weather that you can be operating in. Some of the typical requirements for a single pilot exemption is an autopilot with approach coupling capability, flight director system, boom microphone, and transponder with an ident switch on the pilot's control wheel. Again, this is just typical. We don't know of this particular pilot's exemption. And the exemption typically spells out the weather minimums you can fly in until you've acquired 100 hours of single-engine pilot flight experience in the aircraft. We don't know if the accident pilot had his 100 hours yet or not. And in this typical exemption, they require that you fly in conditions that are no lower than 1/2 mile visibility, 100 and 1/2. Unfortunately, in this accident, we don't know what the weather exactly was at Montgomery at the time of the accident, another big hole in the Swiss cheese, but the reporting nearby weather was 200.5. And this is for straight-in approaches, different minimums for circling approaches. So my question for investigators are, what was this pilot's single pilot exemption weather minimums, and did he have the required time to fly in those sorts of weather conditions? Besides the ATIS or ASOS being out for the arrival airport, the runway alignment indicator lights, the little rabbit run lights that helps lead you into the runway, were also out of service. And this preliminary report clears up which category the aircraft itself is cleared to operate in, and the CE500 series aircraft is considered a Category B aircraft, so he was legal to fly these Category B weather minimums as long as he could operate the aircraft below the Category B speeds while on final approach. There was, in fact, a cockpit voice recorder on board this aircraft, and it was recovered from the wreckage, and it's sent to the NTSB for further examination and audio extraction. The left and right engine FADEC units were recovered and retained for data. There is no flight data recorder for this aircraft. Now, in this preliminary report and in all the ATC audio exchanges that I've heard, there's no indication of an altimeter setting. What altimeter setting was this pilot using? And without the ATIS or ASOS working, was there an altimeter setting available for his arrival destination, for the approach that he was flying? And if we look under the Airman's Information Manual, Air Traffic Procedures, Arrival Procedures 5-4-5, Instrument Approach Procedures, if I'm reading this correctly, when the altimeter settings on which the approach is based is not available, the approach is not authorized. Is there any exemption to this rule that would have allowed this pilot to legally fly this approach without an altimeter setting for the approach which he was flying? Looking at this instrument approach plate, I don't see an alternate means of compliance without altimeter setting. It looks to me like you needed to have the altimeter setting for Montgomery. So was the pilot legal to fly the approach in this respect? Was the air traffic controller allowed to clear the pilot for this approach without this altimeter setting? So now let's get to the narrative part of the report. The airplane approached Montgomery. The pilot checked in on the frequency with SoCal Tracon at 17,000 feet. The controller informed the pilot that the ASOS at Montgomery was out of service, and the pilot acknowledged that he was aware of that. The controller asked the pilot what approach he'd like to fly into Montgomery, and the pilot responded he'd like to fly the RNAV GPS approach to runway 28 right, but he did not specify whether he was going to use the LPV or VNAV and LNAV approach. The pilot was then cleared direct to Nesty approach fix and instructed to descend to 9,000 feet. The pilot subsequently asked the controller if he could assist in determining the weather conditions at his arrival airport, and the controller provided the weather at Miramar, 4 miles to the north, as a half-mile visibility, indefinite ceiling, and 200. And we heard all this all on the ATC audio. The pilot then discussed alternate airport weather conditions with the controller in the event of a missed approach, and would notify SoCal of his selection of an alternate airport, but did not do so during the remainder of the flight. When the airport was about 10 miles northeast of Nesty, the controller asked the pilot if he was going to make your descent. In other words, he's hot and high, and asked if he would like vectors to the south. In order to help make a stabilized approach, you want to hit Nesty on speed and on altitude. You don't want to try to attack this approach from above the approach. So ATC was giving him an out here, trying to help him get squared away for this instrument approach, get squared away to make a stabilized instrument approach. But the pilot replied, I think I'll be all right. And the airplane was at about 8,000 feet and 270 knots ground speed at that time. Very fast. The controller informed the pilot that he was 5 miles from Nesty and instructed him to cross Nesty at or above 3,800 feet, and he was cleared for the RNAV approach to 28 right, which the pilot acknowledged. So here's Nesty on the instrument approach plate. He's cleared to cross it at or above 3,800 feet, and the minimum crossing altitude is 3,600 feet. NTSB data showed that he crossed Nesty at 3,750, so 50 feet below what the controller told him, but 150 feet above the minimum for that point, at 200 knots ground speed. The aircraft continued to slow and descend, and it crossed Penny, the final approach fix, at an altitude of 2,450 feet MSL and 175 knots. Penny is located here with a minimum crossing altitude of 2,500 feet, so he's already 50 feet below the vertical guidance at this point. So about this time, he switched over to the local Unicom frequency and made a position report over the final approach fix, or 3 miles on the approach, and he keyed up the mic 7 times trying to get the runway lights to light up. And then he crossed Paulos, which is 2.9 nautical miles from the runway, for 28 right, at 1,190 feet MSL, and got this aircraft slowed down to 120 knots. But Palos has that minimum crossing altitude, you saw it on the plate there, of 1,380 feet. So now he's 200 feet too low. And he continued to descend all the way below minimums, with the last data point at 464 feet MSL, striking the power lines short of the runway. One of the things investigators are going to be looking at is what sort of configuration did he have his automation going on inside the cockpit of the aircraft? If you're attempting to approach a vertical path from above, did the pilot lose altitude protection in his altitude select window based on what he was doing approaching the approach from on high? What mode did he have the automation in as he was trying to capture the vertical guidance on this approach? Because normally you would set your minimums in your altitude select window, and that would protect you, give you altitude protection, and level off the aircraft at minimums. What mode did this pilot have the aircraft in, or was he simply hand flying at this point and just blew through minimums? And without a flight data recorder, we may never know that. We may be able to glean some information from the cockpit voice recorder, but unlikely. So he ended up striking the transmission lines at about 500 feet MSL, just 1.8 miles from the runway, and it looks like it took out the left horizontal stabilizer, the left elevator, and the vertical stabilizer, as they were located just 200 feet downrange from the lines. So a relatively low-time pilot to the Cessna Citation jet with a fairly freshly minted single-pilot exemption from the FAA stacks the odds against himself, and it leads to disaster. Everything from, I'm still not clear on what altimeter setting did he use for this approach. Did that lack of an altimeter setting even make this approach legal for him to shoot in the first place? He's attempting to take a look with the weather conditions below minimums for the instrument approach, using weather information from an airport other than the airport, his destination airport, because the ASOS is out of order. The runway alignment lights are NOTAMed in op. He's already flown all the way across the country. He started about 11 o'clock in the evening the night before with a stop halfway across the country. He's got the stress of a plane load of passengers along with him, and single pilot by himself, nobody else to help him. And the end result is an unstable approach trying to attempt to capture the vertical guidance from above that leads to disaster. These are the kind of odds that you don't need to stack against yourself when attempting these sort of operations. Thank you so much for your support of this channel, especially the folks over on Patreon that make this content possible. See you here.